Tonight, Canada's role in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Some of the Prime Minister's recent statements have focused more attention on the 16-member alliance and the value of the strategies that NATO has been pursuing in Europe, where it faces the forces of the Warsaw Pact. Canada played a major role in the creation of NATO in 1948 and in the deployment of forces in Europe over the decades that followed. But now, by any measure, the Canadian role has diminished.
A couple of months ago, the Prime Minister reacted angrily when senior American officials suggested Canada was not pulling its weight in NATO, but questions about the Canadian contribution have been raised more frequently and more forcefully by NATO allies for 15 years. Are the Canadian forces up to the roles assigned them within the alliance? Are Canadian soldiers ready or not? The Journal's Terence McKenna reports.
The Canadian Forces Base, Baden, West Germany. 22-year-old CF-104 Starfighter jets are rolled out for the regular afternoon practice bombing mission. The old Starfighter fleet is racked with maintenance problems and notorious crashes, and so the pilots have to wait through extra long safety checks and maintenance procedures. They're hoping that the afternoon training mission will not be hampered by the regular delays and disruptions. The time is 1400 hours GMT. At the same hour, it's morning in Ottawa. Canada's new Defence Minister, Jean-Jacques Blais, is getting ready for his first ride in Canada's newest fighter aircraft, the CF-18. It's a familiar publicity exercise for defence ministers, designed to draw attention away from Canada's old and crippled air fleet and highlight the government's new commitment to upgrading the armed forces. Canada now has 25 of the new aircraft, with 113 more on order, total cost $5 billion. The takeoff in Ottawa goes without a hitch. But on the runway in Baden, at the most dangerous part of a starfighter's takeoff, the flight is aborted. The pilot must once again limp back to the hangar. Similar scenes are played out every day in every branch of Canada's armed forces.
At this present time, the Canadian forces, both regular and reserve, are undermanned, under-equipped, and underfunded.
Some of our troops over there have been put in embarrassing situations because, they've been, in essence, insulted by other members of the alliance for the lack of support that the Canadian government has given to our NATO commitments.
But Jean-Jacques Blais takes a different view of things from his vantage point. In spite of a decade of Liberal government defence cuts, he says Canada's ready to meet its commitments to its allies.
So we've maintained that commitment that we've made to NATO. We've been one of the few NATO countries to so maintain the commitment, and we're intent on maintaining that commitment.
When the Trudeau government cut Canada's NATO commitment in half in 1970, it came as a major shock to our allies and to our troops. Canadian forces were pulled off the front line and placed in reserve here in Western Germany. For most of 10 years, they watched their equipment and their capability decline, often because defense budgets were frozen. But today, these troops still have important jobs assigned to them, and the Trudeau government says those commitments can be fulfilled. They point to the money they've spent on these new Leopard tanks, money they're going to spend on new ships and planes. But their confidence is not supported by some of the other things you find here at Canadian Forces bases in Europe.
The Canadian forces in action can be an impressive sight. In Germany, there's a mechanized brigade expected to engage Warsaw Pact forces over the Czechoslovakian border. When displaying their power for visiting VIPs, they try their best to fulfill the high expectations of defense ministers. When Jean-Jacques Blais looks at the Canadian forces here, he likes to point out some of the expensive modern equipment they have. He sees an effective army of happy and well-trained men.
We spend more time training. We meet the NATO standards. Very few of the NATO allies meet those standards. And the morale of the troops is immensely high.
No, morale is not high.
Lieutenant Lyle Fast expresses a commonly held view among Canadian troops in Europe. He is free to talk because he has handed in his papers. He's quitting.
They have a lot of pride in being the Canadian troops, but unfortunately we can't back it up with equipment, and they know that, and it's it's a difficult situation because we have to ask these people to fight a war for us, but we're not willing to give them the weapons and the equipment to do it.
A close look at the Royal 22nd Infantry Regiment, even when demonstrating its best attack technique, reveals crucial weaknesses. The men are only issued with chemical and biological warfare training suits, ineffective against a real attack because they're worn and ripped and over-laundered. With their 27-year-old FN rifles, they have to squeeze out the shots one at a time, while their enemies and most of their allies can fire 2 or 3 times that number of bullets with automatic weapons. In the last major exercise, almost 3/4 of their 50 caliber machine guns fired out of control because the barrels were burned out. Many rifles have broken sights that can't be replaced. These soldiers believe such handicaps may cost them their lives. But in the nuclear age, others wonder why it's important for Canada to even maintain a conventional army on foreign soil. Critics say it's a waste of money to have these men play at war games. But Canadian generals like René Gutnick answer that NATO's conventional armies prevent nuclear war.
Any greater time that we could sustain this capacity, our capacity to fight a conventional war, retards the moment at which we have to consider the decision of whether we want to use nuclear weapons first or not. It is not a very popular concept to have to do this, or to have such a policy. We are forced into it by the balance of conventional weapons.
There are others who say that the Canadian soldier in Europe is struggling to keep up with too many assignments. That the government has given them roles they cannot hope to fulfill, that they are rushed into situations they're just not ready for, which angers the soldiers and the defense critics.
I'm of the view that the Liberal governments of the day have really not been sufficiently concerned about the relationship between our commitments to NATO and Western security on the one hand, and our capabilities to fulfill those commitments on the other.
What we have to do is look at the international organizations to which we belong, including NATO, and make sure that we have a credible participation. My view is that we have a credible participation.
In 1970, Canada cut its NATO participation by pulling half its troops back from the European Central Front, and so the alliance removed the rest into the reserve position. The Canadian Navy remained committed to patrolling the North Atlantic shipping lines, and then in 1976, Canada accepted yet another role, a Canada-based rapid deployment force to be transported by air and sea to reinforce Norway. You have to look closely at these 3 major NATO roles to assess the preparedness of Canadian forces. $2.6 million NATO troops face 4 million Warsaw Pact troops across the Central Front on the West German border. If fighting broke out and trouble spots emerged, Canadian troops would be brought in from their reserve position in Lahr, headquarters of the 3,300-man Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group armed with tanks and artillery. In Baden, there is also an 800-man Canadian Air Group. At the Canadian air bases in Germany, there are some indicative problems that are almost too bad to be true. Low-level air defense is one. These anti-aircraft Boffin guns are World War II vintage, pulled off the decks of the scrapped aircraft carrier Bonaventure and installed here, theoretically, to shoot down modern Soviet fighter bombers. These men can fire this gun for real only once a year. They'd have a tough enough time against old propeller planes. To aim them without radar at supersonic attack aircraft is a joke, but it's no laughing matter for the Canadian pilots who fly from this base.
We'll take 30-second spacing between you and me at the target.
Right. The pilots of 441 Squadron plan their practice bombing missions down to the second. They have to approach their work with extreme caution, if not without bravado.
Okay, let's go get our final int brief and walk out, and let's get those guys.
I have 4 104s departing. Okay. The wind is 210 at 15 knots.
Lord 18, Slingen Tower, I have your visual along the Rhine. Report clearing in the south.
The pilots here always hope for clear skies because they can't fly the old planes when the weather is bad. So in case of war, they have to hope for good weather. They have to hope the enemy won't take advantage of their vulnerability to attack on the ground. They have to hope there will be enough warning for much of their squadron manpower to be brought over from Canada.
104 is departing. The